The sun is setting over the Taklamakan desert, and Ahmad ibn Rashid sits cross-legged beside his camel, watching the last light fade from the dunes. In his weathered hands, he holds a small piece of silk, not the lustrous, expensive silk that will make him wealthy in Damascus, but a simple square, worn soft from years of handling. His father gave it to him. His father's father gave it to his father. And, before that, the story grows dim, lost in the gentle repetition of generations. Tonight, in this moment of stillness between one day's journey and the next, Ahmad represents something remarkable that few people realize. He is part of the world's first global supply chain. Not global in the way we think of it today, with cargo ships and airplanes, but global in a deeper, more patient way. Global in the way that silk from his homeland will warm a Roman senator's wife against the winter cold. Global in the way that Chinese tea will steep in a Venetian merchant's cup. Global in the way that ideas, languages, and dreams travel along with goods, carried by people like Ahmad who measure their lives not in days or weeks, but in seasons and years of slow, careful movement across the vastness of the world. There are no headlines written about Ahmad ibn Rashid. No monuments built to his memory. He is not a general or a king or a philosopher whose name echoes through history. He is something quieter, something more essential. He is a link in a chain that connected the world for the first time. A chain made not of metal, but of trust and patience and the deep human desire to share the beautiful things we create with people we will never meet. As the stars begin to appear above the desert, Ahmad folds the silk square carefully and tucks it into his robes. Tomorrow, his caravan will continue west. Tonight, he will sleep as traders have slept for 1,000 years before him and will sleep for 1,000 years after, beneath the same stars, dreaming the same dreams of distant markets and safe passage, of profit and return, of the long, slow rhythm that binds the world together one journey at a time. This is the story of the Silk Road traders. Not the story you might expect, filled with adventure and danger, but the true story, the quiet story of routine and patience, of careful planning and gentle persistence. The story of how ordinary people created something extraordinary, a network of trust and exchange that would become the foundation for every global economy that followed. The geography of dreams. In the year 845 CE, the world was vast in a way that is difficult for us to imagine today. To travel from Chang'an, the great capital of Tang Dynasty China, to Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, required not weeks or months, but years. The distance was not just measured in miles, but in languages learned, customs observed, seasons endured, and relationships carefully cultivated along the way. Ahmad ibn Rashid was born into this world in the trading city of Samarkand, in what we now call Uzbekistan. But to call it Uzbekistan would mean nothing to Ahmad. He knew it as a crossroads, a place where the world came together. Samarkand in the 9th century was like a beating heart at the center of the known world, pumping life and goods and ideas through arteries of trade that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Japan. The city itself was a marvel of practical beauty. Its walls rose from the earth like natural hills, built from the same sandy clay that made up the desert around it. Within those walls, the bazaars hummed with a dozen languages. Persian mixed with Arabic, Chinese with Sogdian, Turkish with Greek. But there was another language too, one that everyone spoke, the language of trade, conducted in gestures and numbers, in the weight of a coin in the palm, in the texture of fabric between fingers, in the way a merchant's eyes would light up when they saw something they knew they could sell. Ahmad learned this language before he learned to read. His father, Rashid ibn Omar, was what the medieval world called a master of the long road, a trader who specialized not in local goods, but in the patient work of moving precious items across vast distances. It was a profession that required not just business acumen, but a particular temperament, the ability to think in years rather than days, to build relationships that might not pay off for decades, to find satisfaction in the slow accumulation of trust and reputation rather than quick profit. The inheritance of patience. When Ahmad was 7 years old, his father took him to the family's warehouse. For the first time. It was a long, low building on the outskirts of Samarkand, built of thick mud bricks that kept the interior cool even in the blazing heat of summer. As they walked through the heavy wooden doors, Ahmad's nose was filled with the most complex mixture of scents he had ever experienced: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from the Malabar coast, cardamom from the mountains of India, and, underneath it all, the clean, almost metallic smell of silk. The warehouse was divided into sections, each devoted to goods from a different part of the world. His father walked slowly between the carefully organized piles, touching fabrics with the reverence of a priest handling sacred texts. Here were bolts of silk in colors Ahmad had no names for, deep blues like the heart of flame, reds like garnets held up to sunlight, greens like the first leaves of spring after a long winter. There were porcelains from China, so thin you could see the shadow of your hand through them, and yet so perfectly made they could survive a journey of thousands of miles without cracking. Each of these things, his father said quietly, represents a year of someone's life. The silk was made by women who spent months feeding silkworms and carefully unwinding cocoons. The porcelain was shaped by potters who learned their craft from their grandfathers. The spices were gathered by farmers who know secrets about soil and weather that have been passed down for generations. Ahmad reached out to touch a piece of silk, but his father gently caught his wrist. "Not yet," Rashid said, but not unkindly. "First you must understand what you are touching. This silk will travel for 2 years before it reaches its final buyer. It will cross deserts where the sand can strip the skin from a man's bones. It will cross mountains where the air is so thin that even the camels struggle to breathe. It will pass through the hands of dozens of people, each of whom must be trusted to treat it with care. By the time it reaches Damascus or Antioch or Constantinople, this piece of silk will have stories to tell that would fill a dozen lifetimes." He knelt down so he was at Ahmad's eye level. "When you touch something that has traveled so far and represents so much work, you must do it with respect. You must understand that you are not just a trader, you are the guardian of other people's dreams." The education of a Silk Road merchant. Ahmad's education began not with books, though he would eventually learn to read and write in Persian, Arabic, and Chinese, but with his senses. His father would blindfold him and have him identify spices by smell alone. The bite of black pepper, the warmth of cinnamon, the brightness of cardamom, the deep, earthy richness of cloves. He learned to recognize good silk by the way it felt between his fingers, the way authentic silk would resist slightly when you pulled it, the way it would warm to your touch, the way it would catch the light like captured water. He learned to judge the quality of porcelain by the sound it made when you tapped it with your fingernail. A clear, singing note meant it was well fired and unlikely to crack during transport. A dull thud meant hidden flaws that would reveal themselves somewhere on the long road west. He learned to recognize real ivory by its weight and the fine cross-hatched pattern that ran through genuine elephant tusk, and to spot the inferior substitutes that unscrupulous dealers might try to pass off to an inexperienced trader. But more than these practical skills, Ahmad learned patience. The silk trade was not a business for men who needed immediate gratification. A trading expedition might be planned for months before departure, take 2 years to complete, and require another year to convert all the goods into profit. A successful Silk Road merchant needed to be able to think like a gardener, planting seeds that might not bear fruit for many seasons, but tending them carefully nonetheless. When Ahmad was 12, his father began taking him on short trading trips to nearby cities. These journeys, which might last only a week or 2, were designed to teach him the rhythm of travel. How to load a camel so that the weight was distributed properly and the animal wouldn't develop sores during long days of walking. How to read the weather in the color of the sunset and the behavior of birds. How to set up camp in a way that protected both goods and travelers from wind and sand and the occasional bandit. But most importantly, these short trips taught Ahmad about the human side of trade. In each city they visited, his father would spend time with local merchants. Not just conducting business, but sharing meals, exchanging news, asking after families. These relationships, Ahmad came to understand, were the real foundation of the Silk Road. Goods might travel thousands of miles, but they did so on a network of trust and mutual obligation that connected traders across vast distances. The language of trust. There was a particular afternoon when Ahmad was 15 that would stay with him for the rest of his life. They were in Bokhara, another great trading city, sitting in the shop of a man named Hassan al-Bukhari. Hassan was a dealer in precious stones, and his shop was a small cave of wonders, rubies from Burma, sapphires from Kashmir, emeralds from the mountains beyond Persia. The shop itself was Tiny, barely large enough for 3 men to sit comfortably, but Ahmed's father treated Hassan with the same respect he might show a king. They had come to Hassan because Ahmed's father was planning a major expedition to China, and he needed rubies to trade for silk. But the negotiation was unlike anything Ahmad had ever witnessed. There was no arguing over prices, no dramatic gestures, no attempts to deceive or outsmart. Instead, the two men sat quietly, drinking tea and talking about their families. Hassan asked after Ahmed's mother's health. Ahmed's father inquired about Hassan's eldest daughter, who was recently married. Only after an hour of this gentle conversation did Hassan reach into a locked chest and withdraw a small leather pouch. From it, he poured a dozen rubies onto a piece of white cloth. They glowed like tiny coals in the lamplight, each one perfectly cut and polished. Ahmed's father examined them carefully, holding each one up to the light, feeling its weight in his palm. "These are good stones," he said finally. "Fair color, good clarity. They will trade well in Kashgar." Hassan nodded. "I have had them for 3 years, waiting for the right trader. They deserve someone who will appreciate their journey." They discussed price then, but it was a discussion between equals, each man making calculations that took into account not just the immediate value of the stones, but the risks of the journey, the reliability of the market, the costs of transport. When they reached agreement, they sealed the deal not with a written contract, but with a handshake and a shared cup of tea. As they left Hassan's shop, Ahmad asked his father why he had trusted a man he saw only once every few years with such valuable goods. His father was quiet for a long time, walking slowly through the maze of Bokhara's covered bazaar. "Trust," he said finally, "is the only currency that works on the Silk Road. Those rubies will travel with us for 8 months before we reach China. During that time, anything could happen: bandits, sandstorms, political upheaval. If Hassan has sold me inferior stones, I won't discover it until I try to trade them, thousands of miles from here. By then, it would be impossible to return them or seek compensation." He stopped walking and looked directly at Ahmad. "But Hassan knows something more valuable than the price of those rubies. He knows that if he cheats me, word will spread throughout the trading network. Within a year, no reputable merchant from Damascus to Beijing would do business with him. His reputation, built over decades, would be destroyed for the sake of one dishonest deal. So you see, his honesty is not kindness, it is good business." The mechanics of wonder. The caravan trade required a kind of organization that was both sophisticated and utterly practical. A major expedition might involve 50 camels, 20 men, and goods worth more than a small kingdom's annual tax revenue. Every detail had to be planned and coordinated with mathematical precision. The camels themselves were marvels of biological engineering, perfectly adapted for their role as the ships of the desert. A good Bactrian camel, the two-humped variety preferred for the cold, high-altitude portions of the Silk Road, could carry 400 pounds of cargo for 25 miles a day, day after day, for months at a time. They could survive for days without water and weeks on the thorniest, most marginal vegetation. But most importantly, they were intelligent and social animals that formed strong bonds with their handlers and could navigate familiar routes with almost supernatural accuracy. Ahmad learned to read a camel's mood in the set of its ears and the angle of its head. A camel with its ears laid back and its head held high was announcing its displeasure with the load or the pace. A camel that began to groan and sway was telling you it was reaching the limits of its endurance. But a camel walking steadily, ears forward, head bobbing gently with each step, was an animal content with its work, and a reliable partner for the long journey ahead. The goods themselves had to be packed with extraordinary care. Silk was bundled in oiled leather to protect it from moisture and packed in the center of the load, where it would be cushioned by less delicate items. Porcelain was wrapped in felt and wool and distributed among multiple camels so that if one animal fell or was lost, the entire shipment wouldn't be destroyed. Spices were sealed in multiple containers, ceramic jars inside leather bags inside wooden boxes, because even a small leak could result in the loss of goods worth a fortune. But perhaps the most complex element of any caravan was the human one. A successful Silk Road expedition required not just traders and camel drivers, but interpreters who spoke the languages of the countries they would pass through. guides who knew the locations of water sources and safe camping spots, guards who could protect the caravan from bandits, and diplomats who could negotiate passage through territories controlled by various kings and governors. The calendar of commerce. The timing of a Silk Road expedition was as carefully choreographed as a religious ceremony. Caravans departing from Central Asia for China typically left in early spring, timing their journey to cross the worst of the desert before the crushing heat of summer and to reach the mountain passes before winter made them impassable. Those traveling west from China usually departed in late summer, following the reverse calendar but with the same careful attention to seasonal conditions. Ahmed's father kept a master calendar that tracked not just weather patterns, but the economic and political cycles of the regions they would pass through. Spring was harvest time in the oases of the Taklamakan Desert, which meant fresh supplies would be available for purchase. Late summer was festival season in many Chinese cities, which meant higher prices for luxury goods but also larger crowds of potential buyers. Winter was the time for maintenance and planning. Repairing equipment, negotiating with suppliers, planning routes for the coming year. This calendar was not just practical, it was also social. The Silk Road operated on a rhythm that connected traders across vast distances. A caravan departing Samarkand in April might encounter other caravans from Damascus in September, from Kashmir in October, from Tibet in November. These meetings were not coincidental, they were carefully orchestrated gatherings that allowed traders to exchange not just goods, but information about market conditions, political developments, and route safety. The morning of departure. The day Ahmad ibn Rashid left Samarkand for his first major expedition to China. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air held the cool promise of dawn. He had been awake for hours, moving through the familiar rituals of departure with the careful precision his father had taught him. Each item was checked and double-checked. The lead ropes of the camels were inspected for wear. The leather straps that would hold the loads were stretched and tested. The balance of each pack was verified by lifting and adjusting until it sat perfectly on each animal's back. Ahmad was now 23 years old enough to lead his own expedition, though he still traveled with his father's blessing and much of his father's accumulated wisdom. This journey would take him farther from home than he had ever been, through the Fergana Valley, across the Pamir Mountains, around the deadly Taklamakan Desert, over the passes of the Tian Shan Mountains, and finally to the great markets of Kashgar and beyond. The caravan consisted of 37 camels, 18 men, and goods that represented nearly everything Ahmed's family owned. There were carpets from Persia, each one representing months of work by master weavers. There were precious stones that Hassan al-Bukhari had selected personally. There were lengths of fine wool from the highland pastures of Afghanistan, and small but incredibly valuable quantities of saffron, gathered thread by thread from autumn crocuses in Kashmir. But the most precious cargo, the items that would make this journey profitable or ruin Ahmed's family forever, were 12 bolts of the finest silk his father had been able to acquire, silk so pure and so skillfully woven that it seemed to hold light within its fibers. In China, this silk would be traded for porcelain, tea, and, most importantly, for raw silk that could be brought back to Samarkand and sold to traders heading west toward Damascus, Antioch, and the great markets of Byzantium. As the sun rose over the walls of Samarkand, the caravan assembled in the courtyard of the caravanserai where they had spent their last night. Ahmad walked slowly among the animals and men, checking each one personally. He paused beside the lead camel, a great patriarch named Yusuf who had made this journey 6 times before. The animal turned its huge head to look at Ahmad with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a kind of patient wisdom. "Well, old friend," Ahmad murmured, touching the camel's neck gently. "Shall we go see what the road has to teach us this time?" The rhythm of travel. The first week of any caravan journey was always the most difficult, as men and animals settled into the rhythm that would govern their lives for the next 2 years. They rose before dawn, loaded the camels by lamplight, and were on the road as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. The pace was deliberately slow, perhaps 3 miles per hour, because the goal was not speed but sustainability. A caravan that pushed too hard in the first weeks would pay the price in exhausted animals and sick men later in the journey. Ahmad rode at the front of the column, but not on horseback like some romantic Vision of a desert prince. He walked, as did all the caravan leaders, because walking kept him connected to the pace and condition of his animals. Behind him, the camels moved in a long, swaying line, their bells creating a gentle music that would become the soundtrack of the journey. Each animal was connected to the one in front of it by a lead rope, creating a living chain that stretched for nearly a quarter mile. The landscape changed slowly around them as they traveled. The fertile oases around Samarkand gave way to harder, more austere country, rolling hills covered with sparse grass and low, thorny shrubs. The air grew drier and thinner as they climbed gradually toward the mountain passes that would take them into China. At night, they camped in prearranged spots, places where previous caravans had dug wells and built windbreaks, where the grazing was adequate for the animals and there was protection from the wind that could spring up without warning. These evening camps became a world unto themselves. The camels were unloaded with the same careful precision they had been loaded with, each bale and bundle checked for damage or shifting. The animals were hobbled and allowed to graze while the men set up their simple shelters and prepared the evening meal. Ahmed's tent was only slightly larger than those of his men, just big enough for his sleeping roll, his personal belongings, and the small portable desk where he kept the journals that recorded every detail of the journey. After the evening meal, as the men sat around small fires talking quietly or playing simple games, Ahmad would update his records. He noted the distance traveled, the condition of the animals, the weather, any interesting encounters with other travelers. But he also recorded subtler things, the morale of his men, the state of the trade routes they had passed, news and rumors picked up from other caravans or settlements. The ecology of commerce. As the caravan traveled deeper into the trading networks of Central Asia, Ahmad began to see how the Silk Road functioned as a kind of economic ecosystem. They were not alone on the road. Hardly a day passed without encountering other caravans traveling in both directions. These meetings were always social occasions, opportunities to exchange news and information that was often more valuable than any physical cargo. From an eastbound caravan, Ahmad learned that there had been early snowfall in the Tian Shan Mountains, which meant they would need to hurry to cross the passes before winter closed them. From a group of merchants returning from Kashmir, he heard that the price of saffron had doubled due to a poor harvest, which meant the small quantity he carried was now worth far more than he had paid for it. From a caravan of Buddhist monks traveling from India to China, he received news about political changes in various kingdoms along the route. Information that could mean the difference between safe passage and dangerous delays. These encounters also revealed the remarkable diversity of the Silk Road trade. Ahmed's caravan was focused on luxury goods, silk, spices, precious stones. But the roads carried everything imaginable. There were caravans carrying nothing but salt from the great deposits near Tashkent. Others specialized in horses, driving herds of the magnificent animals bred in the Fergana Valley to markets in China where they were prized above almost any other commodity. Some caravans carried books and manuscripts, feeding the appetites of scholars and collectors across the known world. But perhaps the most important cargo that traveled the Silk Road was invisible. Ideas, technologies, and cultural knowledge that passed from trader to trader, city to city, kingdom to kingdom. Ahmad carried with him not just goods, but techniques for making glass that had been developed in Damascus, mathematical concepts that had originated in India, and artistic styles that blended influences from Persia, China, and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. The art of navigation. Crossing the vast distances of Central Asia required navigational skills that combined ancient wisdom with practical experience. The caravan leaders carried no maps in the modern sense. Instead, they relied on a mental geography built up over years of travel and passed down through generations of traders. Ahmad had learned to navigate by reading the landscape itself. The distant peaks of mountains could be seen for days before you reached them, providing fixed reference points in an otherwise featureless landscape. The courses of rivers, even when the rivers themselves were dry, left marks on the land that could be followed like highways. The patterns of vegetation revealed the locations of underground water, even in apparently barren country. But the most reliable navigation tools were the stars. Every night, as the caravan made camp, Ahmad would spend time studying the sky, taking careful note of the positions of the constellations he had learned as a child. The North Star was his most constant companion, always hanging in the same position relative to the northern horizon. But he also knew the seasonal movements of other stars, the way the Pleiades appeared in different parts of the sky depending on the time of year, the way certain bright stars could guide a traveler even when clouds obscured the North Star. The physical act of navigation was supplemented by a network of human knowledge that extended across the entire route. In every town and oasis, there were local guides who knew the peculiarities of their particular region, which wells might be dry, which paths might be blocked by rockslides, which local officials might require special diplomatic attention. These guides were not just hired help, they became temporary members of the caravan, sharing meals and stories and adding their own knowledge to the collective wisdom of the group. The desert crossing. 6 weeks after leaving Samarkand, Ahmed's caravan reached the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, a name that translates roughly as place of no return. Stretching for nearly 500 miles from east to west and 250 miles from north to south, the Taklamakan was one of the most formidable obstacles on the entire Silk Road. It was a landscape of constantly shifting sand dunes, extremes of temperature that could kill both from heat and cold, and winds that could strip away a caravan's water supplies in a matter of hours. But the desert was not entirely lifeless. It was dotted with a string of oases, Khotan, Yarkand, Kashgar, that served as stepping stones across the vast emptiness. These oases were the creation of underground rivers that carried snowmelt from the distant mountains, allowing small pockets of intensive agriculture to flourish in the midst of absolute desolation. The approach to the Taklamakan required even more careful preparation than the earlier portions of the journey. Water containers were filled to capacity and supplemented with additional skins carried by specially designated camels. The men equipped themselves with long robes and face coverings that would protect them from blowing sand. Extra feed was loaded for the animals, because the sparse vegetation of the desert could not support a large caravan. Most importantly, the timing of the desert crossing was coordinated with other caravans to ensure that if disaster struck, a sandstorm, a guide's error, the failure of a water source, help would be available. The Taklamakan was crossed not by individual caravans racing against time, but by a carefully orchestrated procession of trading expeditions, each one supporting and watching out for the others. The first day in the desert established a routine that would govern the next month of travel. They rose in the deep darkness before dawn and were moving by the time the first faint light appeared in the east. The morning hours, when the air was cool and the wind was calm, were the time for serious travel. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, the pace slowed. During the worst heat of midday, they stopped entirely, creating whatever shade they could with cloth stretched between the camels and waiting for the temperature to become bearable again. The evenings in the desert had a beauty that was almost supernatural. As the sun set, the sand dunes would glow with colors that seemed to come from within. Deep golds and reds and purples that shifted and changed as the light faded. The night sky, unmarred by any source of artificial light, revealed stars in such profusion that Ahmad sometimes felt he was looking up through the floor of heaven itself. But the desert nights were also times of profound silence and solitude. The conversations that had been so much a part of the earlier camps became more subdued. Men sat quietly, conserving their energy and their water, thinking thoughts that seemed to match the vastness of the landscape around them. Ahmad found himself spending these evening hours thinking not just about the immediate challenges of the journey, but about larger questions, the nature of the world they were traveling through, the meaning of the connections they were creating between distant peoples, the way that trade and travel changed not just the goods being carried, but the people carrying them. The Oasis of Khotan. After 2 weeks in the desert, the caravan reached the Oasis of Khotan, and it seemed to Ahmad like entering a different world entirely. The transition was startling. One day they were traveling through empty sand dunes where the only signs of life were the occasional tracks of desert animals, and the next day they were walking through groves of mulberry trees and fields of cotton that seemed almost impossibly green after the monochrome landscape of the desert. Khotan was a city that existed entirely because of its position on the Silk Road. It produced little that couldn't be found elsewhere, but it served as a crucial rest stop and resupply point for caravans crossing the desert. The city's economy was entirely devoted to supporting trade. There were caravanserais that could house Hundreds of travelers and thousands of animals, markets where everything a trader might need could be purchased or repaired, and workshops where skilled craftsmen could repair damaged goods or create new items to order. But Khotan was also something more than just a commercial way station. It was a place where cultures met and blended. The population included Chinese settlers, Persian merchants, Indian Buddhist monks, and Turkish nomads, all living together in a kind of cosmopolitan harmony that was unique to the Silk Road cities. The architecture reflected this diversity: Chinese-style courtyards next to Persian gardens, Buddhist temples sharing streets with Islamic mosques. Ahmed's caravan was assigned space in one of the city's largest caravanserais, a massive complex built around a central courtyard where the camels could be fed and watered while the goods were stored in secure chambers around the perimeter. The caravan would rest here for a week, giving the animals time to recover from the desert crossing and the men time to enjoy simple pleasures they had been denied for weeks: hot baths, fresh food, the company of people who weren't part of their traveling group. But the stop in Khotan was also a time for serious business. Ahmad spent his days visiting the workshops and warehouses of local merchants, not to buy or sell in any major way, but to gather information about market conditions further east. The price of silk in Kashgar, the demand for precious stones in the Chinese capital, political conditions along the route ahead, news of other caravans and their success or failure in recent months. These conversations took place over elaborate meals that stretched far into the evening, in gardens where fountains provided a gentle soundtrack to negotiations. The merchants of Khotan were specialists in the art of extracting and sharing information, and they maintained networks of contacts that extended across the entire trading world. A merchant in Khotan might know about a shipwreck in the Arabian Sea that had disrupted the supply of pepper, or about a new emperor in China who had changed the regulations governing foreign traders. The gradual approach to China. Leaving Khotan, the caravan entered the final phase of its eastward journey, and Ahmad began to notice the subtle ways that the world was changing around them. The people they encountered looked more and more Chinese, not just in their physical features, but in their clothing, their architecture, their ways of organizing their cities and farms. The written characters on signs and milestones shifted from Arabic and Persian scripts to the intricate ideographs of Chinese writing. The landscape, too, began to show Chinese influence. The irrigation systems became more sophisticated, with networks of canals and water wheels that allowed intensive agriculture even in relatively dry areas. The roads themselves were better maintained, wider and more carefully engineered than anything they had encountered in the western portions of their journey. But perhaps the most significant change was in the organization of trade itself. In Central Asia, commerce had been largely a private affair, individual merchants and families organizing their own expeditions and taking their own risks. As they approached China, they encountered a more regulated environment where trade was supervised by government officials and conducted according to standardized procedures. This change was most evident when they reached Kashgar, the last major trading city before entering China proper. Kashgar was technically part of the Chinese Empire, and it operated under Chinese law and Chinese administrative practices. The caravan was required to register with government officials, declare the nature and value of their cargo, and pay taxes that would allow them to trade in Chinese markets. This process, which took several days, was Ahmed's first real encounter with the Chinese bureaucratic system. Everything was documented in multiple copies, with elaborate seals and signatures that certified the legitimacy of the caravan and its cargo. The officials they dealt with were polite but formal, conducting their business according to procedures that had been refined over centuries of regulating trade with foreign merchants. But Ahmad also began to appreciate the advantages of this system. The Chinese regulation of trade meant that merchants who followed the proper procedures could expect protection and support from government authorities. Roads were maintained, bandits were suppressed, and disputes between merchants were settled according to established law rather than left to private negotiation. The art of cultural translation. As the caravan penetrated deeper into Chinese territory, Ahmad found himself becoming a kind of cultural translator, helping his men understand and adapt to customs that were often very different from what they were accustomed to. The Chinese approach to business, for example, was more formal and ritualized than what they had experienced in Central Asia. negotiations began with elaborate exchanges of gifts and courtesies that might seem pointless to a merchant from Samarkand but were essential to establishing the proper relationship for conducting business. Ahmad had prepared for this aspect of the journey by studying Chinese customs during previous trips and by cultivating relationships with Chinese merchants who had visited Samarkand. He knew, for example, that the Chinese placed enormous importance on maintaining face, avoiding situations where anyone involved in a negotiation might be embarrassed or made to appear foolish. This meant that negotiations proceeded slowly and indirectly, with much attention paid to allowing all parties to feel they had achieved an honorable outcome. He also understood the Chinese approach to quality, which emphasized not just the immediate appearance of goods but their long-term durability and the reputation of their makers. A piece of Chinese porcelain was not just a container. It was a work of art that bore the signature, often literally, of the craftsman who made it and the workshop where it was produced. This attention to provenance and reputation meant that building relationships with the right producers was more important than simply finding the lowest prices. These cultural differences extended to every aspect of daily life. The Chinese approach to meals, for example, was much more communal than what Ahmad's men were used to. Dishes were shared rather than served individually, and there were elaborate protocols governing who was served first and how food was offered and accepted. The Chinese attitude toward animals was also different. Camels, which were essential partners in the Central Asian trading system, were seen by the Chinese as exotic creatures suitable mainly for display or ceremonial purposes. The capital of silk. The climax of Ahmad's eastward journey came when his caravan finally reached Chang'an, the great capital of Tang Dynasty China. Nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for a city of this scale and sophistication. Chang'an, in the 9th century, was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people, with broad avenues laid out in a precise grid pattern and massive gates that were opened and closed according to a schedule as regular as the movement of the stars. The city was divided into districts, each with its own character and function. There was a district for government officials, with elaborate palaces and office buildings, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens. There was a district for scholars and students, centered around libraries and academies where the wisdom of centuries was preserved and transmitted. And there was a commercial district where merchants from across the known world came to buy and sell goods that represented the finest achievements of human craftsmanship. Ahmad's caravan was assigned quarters in the Foreign Merchants District, a cosmopolitan area where traders from India, Persia, Central Asia, and even distant lands like Arabia and Byzantium maintained permanent representatives. Here, the air was filled with a dozen languages and the shops displayed goods from every corner of the world: ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic Sea, incense from Ethiopia, precious stones from Sri Lanka. But what impressed Ahmad most about Chang'an was not its size or its wealth, but its organization. Everything functioned according to systems that had been perfected over centuries. The water supply was managed through a network of wells and canals that delivered clean water to every district. Waste was collected and removed according to regular schedules. The streets were swept and maintained by teams of workers whose efforts were coordinated by a bureaucracy that tracked every detail of urban administration. The markets themselves were marvels of organization. Each type of good had its designated area: silk in one section, porcelain in another, spices in a third. Within each section, the merchants were arranged according to their reputation and the quality of their goods, with the most prestigious dealers occupying the most desirable locations. Prices were posted publicly, and there were official inspectors who verified the quality and authenticity of goods offered for sale. The transformation of goods. The months Ahmad spent in Chang'an were a period of careful negotiation and gradual transformation. The goods he had carried from Samarkand, precious stones, fine wool, small quantities of saffron, were not sold quickly or casually. Instead, they became part of an elaborate process of exchange that involved multiple intermediaries and took weeks or even months to complete. The rubies that Hassan al-Bukhari had selected so carefully were eventually traded to a dealer who specialized in jewelry for the imperial court. They would be set in gold worked by craftsmen whose families had served the emperor for generations, becoming part of ceremonial pieces that might be worn once a year. During the most important state occasions, the saffron was purchased by a merchant who supplied the kitchens of wealthy families, where it would be used to create dishes so subtly flavored that only the most educated palates could properly appreciate them. But the most complex transaction involved the silk that Ahmad had brought from Central Asia. This silk, fine as it was not simply sold to Chinese buyers. Instead, it was traded for an even more valuable commodity, raw silk of a quality that could only be produced in certain regions of China, by silkworms fed on leaves from ancient mulberry groves whose cultivation was guarded as a state secret. This Chinese silk, carefully packed in waterproof containers, would be the foundation of Ahmad's profit when he returned to Samarkand. But it represented something more than just a successful business transaction. The silk he carried west would eventually reach weavers in Damascus and Constantinople who would transform it into fabrics of extraordinary beauty, cloth that would drape the shoulders of Byzantine empresses and adorn the walls of Persian palaces. The porcelain journey. Alongside the silk, Ahmad's return cargo included porcelain that represented the pinnacle of Chinese ceramic artistry. These were not the simple bowls and cups that might be used for everyday purposes, but pieces created specifically for export, vases with designs that told stories from Chinese literature, plates decorated with landscapes that captured the essence of mountains and rivers in a few perfect brushstrokes, cups so thin they seemed to be made of solidified light. Each piece of porcelain had been selected not just for its beauty, but for its ability to survive the long journey westward. The Chinese potters who created export were understood the stresses that their work would endure, the constant vibration of camel transport, the extreme changes in temperature between desert days and mountain nights, the handling by men who might not fully understand the fragility of what they carried. The porcelain was packed with the same care that had been devoted to the silk. Each piece was wrapped individually in soft cloth, then nested in containers filled with sawdust or cotton that would cushion them against shock. The containers themselves were waterproofed and designed to be easily carried by the camels without shifting or tilting. The total weight of the porcelain cargo was carefully calculated to balance against the other goods so that each animal carried exactly the right load. But beyond its practical value, the porcelain represented something almost magical to the people who would eventually own it. In a world where most people ate from wooden bowls and drank from leather cups, porcelain was a material that seemed to belong to the realm of fantasy. It was white as snow, smooth as silk, and rang like a bell when you tapped it. In the markets of Damascus or Antioch, a single piece of fine Chinese porcelain might be worth more than a craftsman earned in a year. The westward road. The return journey began in early spring, when the mountain passes were clear. But the weather was still cool enough to make desert travel bearable. Ahmad's caravan was larger now, 43 camels instead of 37, because the Chinese goods he carried were bulkier than the concentrated luxury items he had brought from the west. But it was also a more confident caravan, because Ahmad and his men now had the experience of having successfully completed the most challenging part of their journey. The rhythm of westward travel was different from the eastward expedition. They were no longer moving into the unknown, but retracing a route they had learned intimately during the previous year. They knew where the best camping spots were, which local officials required special diplomatic attention, where supplies could be purchased and where it was necessary to carry extra water or feed for the animals. But the return journey also had its own challenges. The political situation along the route had changed during the year they had been away. A new governor in one province had imposed additional taxes on foreign merchants. A local war in another region had made certain roads unsafe and forced caravans to take longer, more difficult alternate routes. A drought in one of the key oases meant that water was scarce and expensive. These challenges required Ahmad to draw on all the skills his father had taught him about the diplomatic side of trade. In each city and town, he spent time with local officials and merchants, not just conducting immediate business but maintaining the relationships that made long-distance trade possible. He shared news from the east, gathered information about conditions to the west, and contributed to the network of knowledge that allowed the Silk Road to function. The desert in reverse. Crossing the Taklamakan Desert on the return journey provided Ahmad with a different perspective on this formidable landscape. Traveling from east to west, they experienced the desert's moods in reverse order, beginning with the more settled eastern approaches and moving toward the wilder, more challenging western regions. This gave Ahmad a deeper appreciation for the way the desert shaped the rhythm and culture of Silk Road trade. The oases, encountered in reverse order, revealed their individual personalities more clearly. Kashgar, approached from the east, showed itself as a city balanced between Chinese and Central Asian influences, equally comfortable with the bureaucratic precision of imperial administration and the more fluid, personal style of desert commerce. Khotan, reached after weeks of desert travel, felt like a miracle of human persistence, a green jewel maintained against all odds in the heart of one of the world's most challenging environments. But it was during the long, empty stretches between oases that Ahmad found himself thinking most deeply about what he had experienced. The desert encouraged contemplation. The vast, unchanging landscape, the steady rhythm of the camel's footsteps, the silence broken only by the gentle sound of bells and the occasional word of encouragement to a struggling animal, all of this created a kind of meditative state that allowed for reflection on larger questions. Ahmad thought about the goods he carried and the people who had made them. Somewhere in China, there were potters whose entire lives were devoted to perfecting the art of creating porcelain. In mountain valleys he had never seen, there were women who spent their days tending silkworms and unwinding cocoons with a patience and skill that seemed almost superhuman. In workshops across Central Asia, there were weavers and metalworkers and jewelers whose creations would travel thousands of miles to bring beauty into the lives of people they would never meet. The network revealed. As the caravan moved westward, Ahmad began to see the Silk Road not as a simple route from one place to another, but as a vast network of relationships and dependencies that connected the entire known world. Every transaction, no matter how small, was part of a larger system that moved goods, ideas, and people across distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The success of his own journey depended not just on his own skills and planning, but on the work of hundreds of other people, the camel breeders who had produced his animals, the craftsmen who had made his equipment, the merchants who had provided his trade goods, the guides who knew the locations of water sources, the officials who maintained the safety of the roads, the bankers who facilitated the complex financial transactions that made long-distance trade possible. But the network extended far beyond the practical requirements of commerce. The Silk Road was also a conduit for ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that transformed every society they touched. The mathematical concepts that Chinese scholars used to calculate the movements of the stars had originated in India and Persia. The artistic techniques that Persian miniaturists used to illustrate manuscripts had been influenced by Chinese painting styles. The agricultural methods that allowed the oases of Central Asia to flourish combined innovations from Rome, China, and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. Ahmad carried with him not just goods, but stories, tales of the places he had been and the people he had met, accounts of customs and beliefs and ways of life that would enrich the understanding of everyone who heard them. These stories, multiplied by thousands of traders making similar journeys, created a kind of cultural cross-pollination that made the medieval world far more cosmopolitan and interconnected than most people realize. The homecoming. When Ahmad's caravan finally came within sight of the walls of Samarkand, nearly 2 years after their departure, the city looked both familiar and strange. The buildings were the same, the layout of the streets unchanged, but Ahmad himself had been transformed by his journey. He had left as a promising young merchant following in his father's footsteps. He returned as a master of the long road in his own right, with the confidence and knowledge that comes only from having successfully completed one of the most challenging commercial enterprises in the medieval world. The process of returning was as carefully orchestrated as the departure had been. The goods were unloaded and inventoried with the same attention to detail that had governed every aspect of the journey. Each item was inspected for damage, weighed, and evaluated according to current market conditions. The camels were examined by veterinarians and given the rest and medical attention they needed. After their long service, the men were paid and given bonuses based on the success of the expedition. But the most important part of the homecoming was not the business aspects, it was the social dimension. Ahmad's return was an event of interest to the entire trading community of Samarkand. Merchants gathered to hear his accounts of market conditions in China, political developments along the route, and opportunities for future trade. His success encouraged other traders to plan their own expeditions and contributed to the pool of knowledge that made the Silk Road function. Ahmed's father, now in his 60s and beginning to step back from the most demanding aspects of trade, welcomed his son with a pride that went beyond the financial success of the expedition. Ahmad had proven himself capable of handling the complex challenges of long-distance trade, the diplomatic skills needed to deal with foreign officials, the practical knowledge required to keep a caravan healthy and moving, the patience to conduct negotiations that might stretch over months, and the judgment to make decisions that could mean the difference between profit and ruin. The calculation of success. The final accounting of Ahmed's expedition revealed a profit of nearly 60% over his initial investment, a remarkable return that reflected both his skill as a trader and the fortunate combination of favorable market conditions and political stability along the route. But the profit was not just measured in money. Ahmad had established relationships with suppliers and customers that would serve his family's business for generations. He had gained knowledge of routes and markets that would allow him to plan future expeditions with greater confidence. And he had earned a reputation for reliability and competence that would make other merchants eager to do business with him. The Chinese silk he had brought back was quickly sold to traders heading west, toward Damascus and Constantinople, where it would eventually be transformed into luxury fabrics for the European market. The porcelain was distributed among several dealers who specialized in serving the tastes of wealthy collectors across the Islamic world. Some pieces would end up in the private collections of princes and governors. Others would be given as diplomatic gifts, carrying with them subtle messages about the sophistication and refinement of their givers. But perhaps the most valuable cargo Ahmad had brought back was intangible: the information, contacts, and experience that would allow him to become a leader in Samarkand's trading community. Within a few years, younger merchants would be coming to him for advice about planning their own expeditions. Craftsmen would seek his input about what kinds of goods were most likely to find favor in Chinese markets. Officials would consult him about political and economic conditions along the trade routes. The cycle continues. As Ahmad settled back into life in Samarkand, he began planning his next expedition. But this time, he would not be traveling alone or even with a single caravan. His success had attracted the attention of other merchant families who wanted to pool their resources for an even larger venture. They proposed a consortium that would send multiple caravans simultaneously, spreading risks and maximizing opportunities for profit. The planning for this new venture took months and involved negotiations that were as complex as any international treaty. Each family had to contribute specific amounts of capital and goods. Routes had to be coordinated to avoid flooding any single market with too much of the same commodity. Timing had to be synchronized so that the caravans would arrive at their destinations when market conditions were most favorable. But underlying all these practical considerations was a deeper understanding of what the Silk Road represented. It was not just a way to make money, though it certainly could be profitable for those who approached it with the right combination of skill, patience, and luck. It was a way of connecting the world, of bringing together peoples and cultures that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. Every bolt of silk that traveled from China to Rome carried with it something of Chinese culture, the aesthetic values that determined its colors and patterns, the technical knowledge that made its production possible, the social relationships that governed its creation. Every piece of Roman glassware that found its way to Chinese markets brought with it Roman ideas about beauty, functionality, and the proper relationship between art and daily life. The legacy of connection. Years later, when Ahmad had become one of the most respected merchants in Samarkand and his own son was beginning to learn the trade, he would often reflect on what the Silk Road had taught him about the nature of human connection. The network of trade routes that linked China with the Mediterranean was not just an economic system, it was a kind of circulatory system for the entire known world, carrying goods, ideas, and people across distances that seemed impossible but which human ingenuity and persistence had made routine. The traders who made this system work were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were not conquerors or kings or religious leaders whose names would be remembered for centuries. They were ordinary people who possessed extraordinary patience and persistence, who were willing to spend years of their lives traveling slowly across vast distances, who understood that the most valuable connections between people are built gradually, through small acts of trust and mutual benefit repeated thousands of times. Ahmed's own journey from Samarkand to China and back was just one thread in a tapestry that included thousands of similar journeys, each one contributing to the larger pattern of connection and exchange that defined the medieval world. The silk he carried became part of garments that adorned the bodies of people he would never meet. The porcelain he transported held tea that warmed the hands of scholars and poets in distant cities. The stories he brought back enriched the understanding of his neighbors and friends, making them citizens not just of Samarkand, but of the world. The Quiet Revolution. What Ahmad and his fellow traders created was a quiet revolution that transformed the medieval world without armies or conquests or dramatic proclamations. They created the first truly global economy, one based not on the extraction of wealth from conquered territories, but on the voluntary exchange of goods and services between peoples who recognized their mutual benefit from trade. This economy required and fostered a level of tolerance and cooperation that was remarkable for its time. Caravans traveling the Silk Road included Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and followers of Zoroaster and other faiths, all working together toward common goals. Cities along the route developed cosmopolitan cultures that accommodated merchants from dozens of different countries and ethnic groups. Languages blended and evolved to facilitate communication between people who might have no other common ground except their mutual desire to trade. The legal and financial innovations that made long-distance trade possible laid the groundwork for economic institutions that we still use today. The letters of credit that allowed a merchant in Damascus to collect payment for goods delivered in Beijing were ancestors of modern banking systems. The insurance arrangements that protected traders against the loss of their goods anticipated modern risk management techniques. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency that facilitated trade across cultural boundaries established principles that still govern international commerce. The eternal return. As Ahmad grew older and his own traveling days came to an end, he found himself thinking more and more about the cyclical nature of the Silk Road trade. Each spring brought new caravans setting out from Samarkand, carrying goods and hopes westward and eastward along routes that had been traveled for centuries. Each autumn brought returning traders with new goods, new stories, and new connections to add to the vast network of relationships that sustained the trade. The individual traders changed, young men replaced their fathers and grandfathers, new families entered the business while others retired or failed, but the system itself continued with a kind of organic persistence that seemed to transcend any individual participant. It was like a great river that flowed steadily eastward and westward simultaneously, carrying with it the products of human creativity and ingenuity and leaving behind a trail of cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Ahmed's own son, now old enough to begin learning the trade, showed the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that Ahmad remembered from his own youth. The routes were the same, the challenges were similar, but each generation brought its own innovations and improvements to the ancient art of long-distance commerce. New techniques for preserving goods during transport, new methods for communicating across vast distances, new diplomatic approaches for dealing with the constantly shifting political landscape of Central Asia. But the fundamental requirements of the trade remained unchanged. Success still depended on patience, persistence, and the ability to build relationships of trust with people from very different cultures. It still required the kind of long-term thinking that could plan expeditions years in advance and the flexibility to adapt to unexpected changes in routes, markets, or political conditions. Most of all, it still required the willingness to spend years of one's life traveling slowly across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, carrying goods that represented other people's dreams and aspirations. Closing reflection. As the evening stars begin their familiar dance across the desert sky above Samarkand, Ahmad ibn Rashid sits in his garden, surrounded by objects that tell the story of a lifetime spent on the Silk Road. There is a piece of Chinese porcelain, so thin that the light of the oil lamp glows through it like captured moonlight. There is a length of silk dyed with indigo from India, its deep blue color seeming to hold all the mystery of distant oceans. There are manuscripts written In scripts he learned to read during long winter nights in mountain passes, and spices whose fragrances carry him instantly back to markets he visited decades ago. But the most precious things in Ahmed's collection are not objects at all, they are memories. The memory of sunrise over the Tian Shan Mountains, when the peaks turned golden pink against a sky so clear it seemed to ring like crystal. The memory of shared meals with fellow traders around campfires in the middle of nowhere, when stories and laughter created a warm circle of human fellowship in the vast loneliness of the desert. The memory of the moment when his caravan first came within sight of Chang'an, and he realized that human beings could create cities so magnificent they seemed to belong to the realm of dreams. These memories, multiplied by thousands of traders across hundreds of years, created something that had never existed before in human history, a truly global civilization, one that connected the Atlantic shores of Europe with the Pacific coasts of China, the grasslands of Russia with the islands of Indonesia, the mountains of Tibet with the deserts of North Africa. It was a civilization built not by armies or emperors, but by ordinary people willing to spend their lives carrying beautiful things slowly across vast distances, creating connections between peoples who might never meet but who were bound together by the silken threads of trade. The Silk Road was never just about silk, and it was never really just one road. It was a network of relationships, a web of trust, a system of patient cooperation that allowed human creativity and ingenuity to flow freely across the boundaries that seemed to divide the world. Every bolt of cloth, every piece of porcelain, every sack of spices carried with it not just economic value, but something of the culture and wisdom and dreams of the people who created it. In our modern world of instant communication and rapid transportation, it is easy to forget the patient persistence that once connected distant civilizations. We can speak to someone on the other side of the earth in real time, but we have lost something of the deep human satisfaction that comes from carrying a message or a gift slowly across vast distances, adding our own care and attention to its journey. We can ship goods around the world in a matter of days, but we have lost the understanding that true value comes not just from the things themselves, but from the relationships and the trust that make their exchange possible. The story of Ahmad ibn Rashid and the countless other traders who created the Silk Road reminds us that the most important human achievements are often the quiet ones, the patient work of building connections, the slow accumulation of trust, the willingness to carry other people's dreams carefully across the distances that separate us. In a world that often seems divided by differences of language, culture, and belief, the Silk Road stands as proof that human beings have an infinite capacity for cooperation and mutual understanding, if only we have the patience to nurture it. As the last light fades from Ahmed's garden and the stars trace their ancient patterns across the sky, the spirit of the Silk Road continues. Somewhere, goods are being carefully packed for long journeys. Somewhere, travelers are checking their maps and their supplies, preparing to venture into unknown territory. Somewhere, people are extending their hands across cultural boundaries, offering trust and friendship to strangers who might become partners in the great human enterprise of connecting the world. And now, as the stars trace their ancient paths above, may you find rest beside the stories of quiet lives long past, knowing that the threads they wove still bind us together across all the distances of space and time. Let your dreams carry you along those patient roads where camel bells still ring softly in the desert wind, where silk still gleams in the lamplight of distant markets, where the human heart still reaches out across vast distances to touch another human heart with the gifts of beauty, trust, and love. Sleep now, and let the gentle rhythm of the ancient roads carry you into dreams, where time moves slowly and every journey, no matter how long, brings us a little closer to understanding the connections that make us all part of one great human family, scattered across the earth but bound together by the silken threads of commerce, culture, and care.